and welcome back to my YouTube channel and my series talking about estrangement, adult and adult-child relationships with parents and all the fun stuff. Today is the second part of answering some of your questions from Instagram. I put out an Instagram Q&A and said, what would you like to know about estrangement? I get hundreds and hundreds of DMs every week of people asking for advice, just looking for somebody to relate to who's been through the experience. I think because it's so taboo, we quite often, when we find somebody who does talk about it, or we find someone who is open and willing to say, oh yeah, actually I don't have the best relationship with my parent either, it can be really a big relief, makes you feel less isolated. It is such an isolating thing. So I wanted to film this series to answer some of your questions, and if some of them are just curiosity as opposed to you've been through it yourself, that's absolutely fine, because I think understanding it when it's not been your lived experience and seeing the stigma around parental estrangement and around a toxic relationship with a parent, and somebody who will openly say, I don't have a good relationship with my parent or parents, it's hopefully going to help break down some of those barriers and make people stop and think before they say things to their friends or family or whatever it might be. And if this is your lived experience, then hopefully this will bring you some comfort to know that you are not alone. Okay, so let's jump into it. So last week I answered some of your questions, and you can find the link down here. I answered some of the more popular questions, things like how has the wider family reacted, do you have any siblings, and that kind of thing. So if you are interested in those questions, or you want to see the first part of this, then head over to that video first. This is the second part. So first question I've got here that I wanted to answer is, how do I know I'm not being unfair and that the whole thing is not me? And I think anybody who has been in this experience, who has had a childhood where they've perhaps been with a narcissistic parent or with an emotionally immature parent who has made them very much feel like it's their responsibility to make the relationship work, will have asked this question of themselves a million times, and I still do it all the time. I will still have conversations with my therapist where I'm like, how do I know I'm not the narcissist? How do I know that I'm not the bad guy? Am I the narcissist? Am I awful? And she's like, no, you're not. You're none of those things. You are somebody who has had this experience, and this is really common. So if you have found yourself in a similar position to myself, and you can listen to my story in a previous video, then no, you are not the one that is being unfair. And if you have tried everything you can with your parent in your relationship, then no, you are not being unfair to say, do you know what, this is really damaging for my mental health and I need to step back. But the best way that I have found personally to work through those feelings and to work through the guilt and the shame and the is it me, am I the problem question is to speak to a therapist and to go to therapy. That has helped me more than I can put into words. It's made me a stronger person. I've chosen to go through person-led therapy, and my therapist specialises in that. She specialises in childhood trauma, and I have just found that having someone to talk to and to express myself with and to reassure me from a professional standpoint that no, I've not done anything wrong, and no, I'm not the one in the wrong, and that the things that I have said and that I feel aren't unreasonable actually aren't unreasonable. And when I'm being told that I'm the problem and I'm gaslighted, that's exactly what it is. And it's not for me to feel any responsibility for that. My responsibility is to take care of my mental well-being and to make sure that I am healing. And that's what my responsibility as an adult is, not to fix the way that my relationship is with my mum if it's not going to be a two-way street. So the recommendation that I can give you is honestly to speak to a therapist, speak to somebody who is qualified, which I am not, and go down that route really, because that's what helped me. It is such a common question, and you are not alone in feeling like you are the problem, you are the one that's caused all of this, because that is what our upbringing teaches us to think. But you're not. You're really, really not. And speaking to a therapist will hopefully help you with that. Okay, so the next one is, how did you tell your mum you didn't want to see her anymore? I have done my story of estrangement, how I actually, the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing, and I wanted to reiterate with this question, it's often a misconception that it's one particular thing that has caused estrangement, and it never is. I've never met anybody who's like, do you know what, it's this one thing that happened, we had an amazing relationship, everything was great, and then it's this one thing that happened that changed my whole relationship, and that's it, I've never spoken to them since. Quite often it is the straw that broke the camel's back, and for me, I never actually did sit down and say to my mum that I didn't want to see her anymore. In my experience, I sat down, I asked my mum to move out of her annex. I explained to her how I foresaw that going, asked her opinion on that. I offered to make sure that she would be fully set up if she moved into either a new property or a rental or however that was going to work, and my mum flat out refused to do so, essentially, and it was a case of, I will live here and I don't care if that makes you unhappy. I will stay in this annex, and if that destroys your family and it destroys your life, fine. So at that point we went down a lengthy legal route, which again I've spoken about in my video about estrangement, how I came to be estranged, and it got to a point where there was no feasible way for us to have a relationship because too much damage had been done, and I knew that staying in any kind of relationship with my mum, even an at arm's length relationship, which is what I wanted when I asked her to move out of the annex, and I expressed that. I'd said that I wanted to be able to come and visit her, I wanted to be able to see her, I wanted to be able to bring the kids to see her, but I just needed that distance. I just needed that normal relationship where she wasn't constantly at me and constantly trying to spoil things for me, trying to control things for me, that resentment that was between us. And for me, the solution was for her to move out of the annex and us to have the same relationship that all my friends have with their parents, where they might go for Sunday dinner, or mum might come to me for Sunday dinner, and that kind of normal, not living in each other's pockets. And for mum, that was not acceptable. And to be blunt, it's because it was a loss of control on her part, which is really common for narcissists, which is what I truly believe she is. And I just feel that I at no point said to her, I can't have a relationship with you anymore, and we can't see each other, and I don't ever want to speak to you again, that I remember. But at a certain point throughout the legal process, it became impossible for us to be in the same room. It became impossible for us to have any communication with each other without it becoming nasty, and that's not something that I need in my life. So after that conversation, and as the legal process proceeded, I haven't seen or spoken to my mum since then, and have no intention to do so. But I think there is this common misconception that you sort of sit down with a parent and say, right, that's it, we're never going to speak to each other again. And again, I don't really know of that ever really happening. So it's never really one conversation. It tends to be so much pain and so much hurt and so much bad blood that it just becomes impossible to communicate and to have a healthy relationship, in which case you stay away from each other. So that's what that has been for me. So this is another one that, I'm going to be honest, I feel ill-equipped to answer this fully. It says, any advice for a daughter-in-law trying to cope with a narcissistic mother-in-law and protect her husband and one-year-old son? She is at the next level, and my husband sees it but refuses to act because of how he'll be perceived with the rest of the family. This is a really hard one to answer because I am not a therapist. I've never claimed to be. I'm not qualified in anything. I'm only speaking from my personal experience and what I have researched and what I have learned about my personal experience and about narcissism, about emotionally immature parents, about the child-parent dynamic, to try and make sense of my own childhood and the things that went on. But from my perspective and from my experience, it is incredibly difficult to know what to do in that situation because it's not your relationship. It's a really slippery slope when a partner starts saying, right, you need to do this or you need to do that. When it becomes too much for you, that's the point at which you have to say, this is too much for me, this is not a dynamic that works, and I need to not have contact with her myself, and I need for our child to step away from that to protect them. But you can't force someone to make that decision, and you can't pressure them to make that decision, and you can't protect them from themselves, I guess, in that dynamic. What I would strongly recommend, if someone is the partner of somebody who is in a toxic or abusive relationship with a parent, is to recommend therapy to them, because the therapist is the one that will then be saying as a completely neutral ground, okay, that's not normal, we need to think about how you're going to protect yourself from that. Okay, that's not acceptable, we need to talk about how you're going to work around that. And no therapist is ever going to turn around and say you need to cut contact or you need to leave your spouse or any of these. They don't say that. They help you to see how you can navigate those relationships to protect yourself. And I think that, from a partner's point of view, is the best thing that you can do. That being said, I remember seeing a life coach 2-3 years before things came to a head with my mum, and she would say to me frequently, you know that this is not okay, yeah? And that is holding you back. This relationship causes you problems and it holds you back. And I wasn't ready to take it on board. And I think that must be an incredibly hard thing for a partner to see and to watch. But from my perspective, I don't think there really is much that you can do other than support them as best you can, protect yourself and your children, and recommend to them to see a therapist. So I really like this one. What is the biggest change that you've noticed after you made the choice? The biggest change is in me, I think, and in the happiness of my children and my family as a whole. It's been a really, really rocky road, and there's been a lot behind the scenes that I haven't discussed and that I'm not really ready to discuss that has happened since. But from the biggest change from that decision in particular has certainly been in me, in the way that I view things, in the way that I react to things, in the way that I communicate things. I feel like I'm a much stronger, more independent person. I'm still working through a lot of issues, and I see a therapist weekly for that, because I think that that is really important for your mental health. I'll be completely honest with you, I think everybody should be able to see a therapist, but that is not the reality that we live in. But it has helped me to see me. I feel like I'm more me. I feel like I am my own person. I make my own choices. I feel free. And I think that's worth its weight in gold. I don't think that you could ever put a price on that. I feel like I am free, and that's the biggest change that I have noticed. And I also have come to realise that I'm very strong on my own and for myself, and I can do whatever I need to do for myself. If it ever comes to a point where I need to do those things for myself and make those choices for myself, I can do that. And I can see things in a completely different light. I also think that my children are much happier. School have commented on how the children are much happier and much freer and lighter. There's no sort of nastiness around the dinner table or anything like that, which there was obviously when Mum was living here. And I think going through that really stressful, horrendous period of time where things were so difficult for everyone has brought us together closer as a family and allowed us to grow, and it certainly allowed me to grow anyway. Okay, so what are you doing in your parenting that protects your kids from what your parents did to you? I'm not parenting like my parents. That's probably the biggest difference. Within my parenting, we have open, honest communication. The kids know that they can ask me absolutely anything, no matter how toe curling it might be. Toby plays football just before a group of sort of 14, 15-year-old boys, so he hears all manner of things. I'm like, oh my God, that's not appropriate. And he will frequently ask questions, and I will answer them as best I can. But the difference between the way that I grew up is that my children are children and are treated as such and allowed to be children, whereas I had a lot of parentification happening when I was younger, which I've done a video about parentification. I will also link that below. And almost became like a substitute spouse for my mum. And that's really unhealthy, and it meant that I was leaned on for a lot of things. I was spoken to about things that were inappropriate, and I was given those adult pressures that no child needs. And that's the difference. We have open, honest communication, but they are not expected to have those adult pressures. If Adam and I have an argument, which we try really hard not to do around the children, then we will reiterate to them that arguing is normal. Everybody does it. All grown-ups argue, but it's not for them to get involved with. It's not for them to take sides. Whereas in my childhood, it was very much side taking, and, you know, a really difficult experience for a child to navigate. So that is one of the ways in which I parent differently. I don't pit my children against anybody, and I don't wield them as a weapon. So that's, again, very different. And I think, you know, if I am unsure of something, I'm quite happy to admit if I've made a mistake. I apologise to my children if I make a mistake, because I'm only a human being, and I will talk to them about it in an age-appropriate manner. So again, that's very different to the way that I was brought up. And I think all those little things, I try to give my children all of the things that I didn't have growing up. And I try to, I think the majority of parents do that. I think the majority of us look at the way that we were parented and go, I'm not keen on that bit, but I liked that bit. Or even if you've had the most wonderful childhood, I think the majority of us look and go, I'm not going to do it that way. But I'm going to do it this way, and oh well, I liked what they did there, and I'm going to do that. It's all trial and error, isn't it? But one of the things that I'm really conscious of doing is treating my children with respect, and treating them as children, allowing them to be children, and allowing them to know that our home is a safe space for them, not a horror show. I thought this one would be quite an interesting one to answer as well. Has your mum tried every means possible to get back into your life? No. No, my mum has not. When we initially asked her to move out of the annex, and we were going through the legal process because she did not want to leave, mum had suggested that we do mediation, but again, that was completely fruitless, because ultimately mum's goal was to stay in the annex regardless of our wishes, regardless of whether that was working. And as I mentioned when I talked about how we became estranged, that wasn't working for anyone. Mum was deeply unhappy over there and referred to it as the shed, would tell me every day how unhappy she was, every day how angry she was she'd been put out there, as she would say, despite the fact that it was a completely custom built, and is, you know, it's got its own bathroom, bedroom, kitchen area, living room, everything about it was built to her design. She was unhappy with it, and nothing I did was ever going to make her happy until I told her that I didn't want her to be there anymore and that I needed more space. And that was when she decided she needed to stay. So it was never about the annex, it was about staying in control, and mediation wasn't going to change anything. So that was turned down and not requested again. And since moving out, mum hasn't had any sort of meaningful attempt to contact. First birthday, I didn't get any birthday cards or anything like that. Second birthday, I did, which I think, to be honest, is just a way of manipulating and trying to show that she's still there and that I still have to cope with that. I don't think that those birthday cards, the children get them as well. And initially, the only person that got a birthday card was Reuben, which really hurt Toby and Edith, and really hurt Reuben as well, because he felt like he'd done something wrong, that he'd got the birthday card but the others hadn't. And then it started where it was the four of us, and I feel like it's purely done as a I'm still here, not anything else. The birthday card that I was sent was very much a long-winded birthday card with paragraphs about how proud you become of a daughter, but how sad you are when she grows up and moves on, and all that typical manipulation that just isn't going to have an effect. As far as, you know, getting in touch and saying, could we sit down and talk about this, or I feel that I've made errors in this as well, absolutely not. Any sort of I've been to therapy and dealt with my stuff and I see where I have gone wrong, can we connect? No. And they're the things that make a meaningful difference. I'm very much a believer that you can be estranged from a parent, and that does not mean, I don't think anything is forever. I think it's something that we tell ourselves but I don't think it necessarily is. And I'm very much a believer that people can change and can make a difference, but there has to be a willing effort to make a difference. And I've seen enough in my parents to know that there never would have been, and that there never will be, and they've proved that time and time again. So as far as of every means possible to get back in my life, no. We have had instances where mum has requested to see the children formally, but that also has not panned out and will not pan out, because I don't see the point in removing myself from the firing line to put them in it. And it's my job as a parent to protect them and protect their mental health, and I don't think that that would be suitable for them. So no, she hasn't, and I think that in itself tells us everything that we need to know. What do you wish other people had done to help you as a child with a narcissistic parent? That's a really difficult one. I don't think anyone really could have done anything. I think from my perspective, again, my mum, to the best of my knowledge, is not diagnosed. My therapist agrees with me that she definitely sounds very narcissistic, but again, doesn't know her, so would not give a diagnosis on that basis, but will often say that I grew up in a narcissistic parenting household from what she told me, from what I've told her and from what she's heard. And a very abusive household from both parents, with neglectful parenting on one side. My dad had left and, you know, has had very little impact, and then my mum on this side, who was very narcissistic. I look at my parents and my stepmother, and it boggles my mind that not one of them thought of the child that was in the middle. I was the only child there, and not one of them at any point sort of stopped and thought, do you know what, this isn't going well. And I resent that, and I think that's really cruel of all three of them, and I can't wrap my head around it as a mother. But as far as externally, I remember when I was really little that I'd been referred to a psychologist, but mum didn't want me to see them without her, and the one occasion that I did, they'd recommended some things that I don't particularly remember, that mum didn't like, and it was very much from that day onwards, psychologists are, you know, not helpful. They're just troubled people who are trying to make other people troubled, or trying to make sense of their own problems and putting it onto you. So I had a very negative view of that. And I just don't think that anybody really could have done anything. There were times when people would say to my mum, that's not normal, you shouldn't be doing that, and she would just pass it off. And I don't think there were ever particularly any long-term friends. If they did flag something to my mum, I think it was just brushed off pretty quick. But I don't know really what I would have wanted them to do. I kind of wish there was somebody there to have stood up and said, this isn't right, we need to change these things. But I think that's the problem. Had they done so, I just thought my mum was the best person in the world and that everything that she did was right until I was in the firing line. And that goes back to that golden child, scapegoat child, which the more I learn about those roles within narcissistic parenting dynamics, the more I realise that as an only child you fit into all of those roles at different times. And you know, when you're in the golden child role, you are the best thing since sliced bread, and you know, it's a lot of pressure, it's difficult to keep up with, but that you're not in the firing line, so it's better to stay in this role. And I wouldn't have accepted anything negative anybody said about my mum anyway. I had to become a mum myself, I think, and see it for myself, and then grow up and get my own ideals and realise that the more I pulled away, something wasn't right here, that she wasn't allowing that. But yeah, I look back and I think, God, I just don't understand how none of them stepped up, none of them realised. And I remember when I was really little, can't have been that little, I must have been, well, I say I can't have been that little, I would have been probably the same age Ruben is now, which is 11, which is really little. I remember going through and having coffee with my mum and my stepmum, and I remember my stepmum and mum just having this awful atmosphere between them, and that was their idea of an attempt to sort of be friendly for me, on the recommendation, I believe, of the courts. My dad, I think, had gone shopping because Why? I don't know. Or maybe he'd just not turned up again, because he did that quite a lot. And I remember my stepmom saying, I think under different circumstances we could have been friends. And my mum saying, absolutely not. And I just remember feeling so awkward and uncomfortable throughout the whole thing. And then I remember that kind of childlike joy, thinking, oh, maybe they'll get along and everything will feel a bit more normal. And I think that's a memory that I've kind of locked away a bit and not thought of for a long time. Because, you know, that was squashed so quickly. I think that's all you want. You want stability and balance as a child, and they're things that I never had. So it would have been nice if somebody could have stepped in and given that, but they didn't, and that's the reality that you face. And as an adult now, I can look at that and reflect on that and see how that shaped me to be who I am now, and work with a therapist to heal those scars and move forwards and make sure that my kids have the stability that they need. How can I support a friend that is estranged from her parents? I think the most important thing that you can do is to offer and support and listen, and not to come out with things like, oh, but you only get one mum, and not to project your experiences and your feelings onto them. You know, I will still sort of get, from friends who know that I don't speak to my mum, you might get the odd, oh, have you heard from your mum? And that's fine. If it's somebody who I know, I'll say, nah, and they'll go, good. Or I will see somebody who I haven't spoken to for a while and they'll be really awkward about it, which is understandable. It's an awkward thing. It's not something that you expect, so don't hold that against them. But when people start saying, oh, but you only get one mum, or extend the olive branch, you just think, it's really frustrating, and it's a projection of your own experiences as a child, perhaps with a normal or a healthy childhood and a healthy relationship where there are those boundaries that are respected on both sides. And that projection doesn't help when you don't have that experience, and when you don't have that healthy, normal relationship with boundaries, when your relationship is toxic and abusive. And I think that just offering that shoulder to lean on, that listening ear, those can be worth their weight in gold. But without judgment is the most important thing, because so many people will sort of try and get you to build a bridge, or get you to you know, reach out. And I don't need to build the bridge. I burnt the bridge, and I'm swimming much better now than I was stumbling across it. And I think that is so important for people to realise. And if you're looking to support a friend who is estranged from parents, just offering that support without any judgment and without any projection from your own experiences. But also equally, it's not sort of necessary for you to be saying, oh yeah, that person's awful, or oh yeah, so evil, or agreeing with them. If they ask your opinion on it, great, but you don't necessarily need to be forthcoming with it, because at the end of the day, you know that. But I still find it quite difficult sometimes to hear negative things about my mum in particular. Not so much my dad, because I grew up hearing nothing but negativity about my dad, so that almost feels normal to me. I really struggle with the flip side of hearing anything positive about him. But just offering and listening is probably the most effective way for you to support any friend going through it. What is the most misunderstood about it, and what do you wish people knew? The most misunderstood categorically is that you are the problem. You know, so many people have commented or said to me, you know, oh, well, you only get one side of the story. And yet you wouldn't say it to somebody who was talking about sexual assault, physical assault. You wouldn't say it to somebody with big scars that you could visibly see. But because you can't see those emotional scars, and because you perhaps met that person and they were really friendly to you, it's really difficult to accept and acknowledge that actually they might not have been the person that you thought they were. So the biggest misunderstanding, I think, is that the child is just being ungrateful, or is just being selfish and spiteful. And I do think that comes from a deep-rooted desire in us to please our parents, to make our parents proud, to respect our parents. If you go back to sort of the 1700s, 1800s, that kind of time, the worst thing that could happen to somebody would be to become cut off from the family. We didn't have our own money and stuff. It was all chained down. Everything was about respecting your elders. Everything was about deferring to that older person. And I do think those cultural norms have slid down in generations. Even though we're now much more independent, we step away, we still defer to our parents. We still have this idea that we have to respect them, that we have to defer to them, that we have to owe them something, and that's completely incorrect. My children don't owe me anything for their existence. They owe me nothing. They don't owe me respect if I can't show it to them, and they didn't ask to be here. I asked for them. So I think the biggest misunderstanding is that it's just someone being a brat, just someone being ungrateful, and I really wish that people could step away from that and see that there are parents out there. The majority of parents are wonderful, and the majority of parents are making mistakes but doing their best, but there are parents out there who are not at all doing that, who are horrendous. And it's not just necessarily the ones that are physically, sexually abusive. It's not just the ones who have addictions. It's not, you know, there are people out there who treat their children really badly emotionally, who are narcissistic or are emotionally immature and refuse to work on that because they don't want to, or they feel there's some barrier in their way. And those parents don't have a right to be in the life of their adult child if they can't respect the boundaries in place. And I wish that people knew and could accept that it's not, no adult child that I have ever met would like to be in this position, or is doing it to prove a point, or is doing it because they want to cause hurt. In my experience, and again, I can only speak from my experience and from all of the people that I have spoken to, from the thousands of people that I speak to all the time about estrangement and about their toxic relationships with their parents. Absolutely nobody wants to become estranged from their parent. People want to repair those relationships, and when we have this assumption that it's just the ungrateful child, or that it's just the child being a brat, or it's because they can't get their own way, or something to that effect, it's misplaced, massively misplaced. And invariably you find yourself in a position of saying, I've done everything I can, everything to make this better, and nothing is working, and now I have to protect myself from that, and that doesn't make me a bad person. And I wish people could accept that and acknowledge that. Do you regret not doing it sooner, i.e. at critical points in your life? Very much so. That's a very simple answer, very much so. I could have saved myself a lot of stress, a lot of heartache, and if I had been strong enough and able, and this is something that I have out with my therapist frequently, I'm like, if I'd have just, and she's like, yes, but that's not your fault, that's not how you were raised, that's not what you were done, you were taught this, you were taught that. But if I had been able to cut ties, or bare minimum create some distance between myself and my mum, I think we'd be on a very different path, and I wish that I had been able to do that. Okay, so how do you not let it affect your mental well-being? It does. That's there's no sort of escaping that. It absolutely affects my mental well-being, but that is why I go to therapy, and I cannot again recommend that strongly enough. I think that if you are in a position to do so, everyone should be trying to go to therapy to just talk through things and to make sense of their experiences and gain perspective on who they are as people. I think therapy has been amazing for me, but it absolutely does affect my mental well-being. You know, it's harder around times like Christmas, my mum's birthday, Mother's Day. They're all more difficult times, and I can feel that it affects my mental well-being, and I can feel that my childhood experiences absolutely affect the person that I am today. But therapy has been amazing for helping to heal and to grow from that. Final question is, do you worry that by sharing you encourage local or family gossip? I am exhausted by it. No. No, I do not. You know, people are going to talk regardless. Mum likes to weave a sorry story at every opportunity that she gets, and you know, I always look at it as you are the bad guy in somebody's story, so you can't deal with what other people think of you. You know your truth and you know your experience. My hope with sharing this kind of thing is that it makes other people feel less alone, and it helps other people to feel more validated. It encourages people to see But there is another route if you are in a toxic relationship with a parent and that you do have that really unhealthy dynamic that is making you unwell. There is another route to come away from that, and it might not be estrangement for you, it might be limited contact, but I do feel that it is so important for us to talk about these things that are so heavily stigmatized, because that is when the guilt and the shame really sets in, when something is so heavily stigmatized that you're completely silenced by it. And if I can encourage one person to take care of their mental well-being, put some boundaries in place and seek therapy, then that will be more than enough to outweigh any kind of gossip or anything like that. People are going to talk anyway, that's not my responsibility. And that is it. I might do another one of these at another time, but I really hope that this has been useful for people. And if you missed number 1, then you can check that out linked below. I answered some of the more popular questions around siblings, extended family members, guilt and that sort of thing. So hopefully this series is proving really useful for people. And if this is your experience, then know that you are not alone and that you can come through it and feel stronger on the other side.